Daniel Parker was the quiet, polite teenager everyone in Red Oak thought they knew until the night police say he slaughtered his own mother, beloved school teacher Elaine Parker, as she slept in her bed. In the quiet town of Red Oak, life seemed almost too ordinary to ever imagine tragedy lurking around the corner. With its tree-lined streets, single stoplight charm, and a community where everyone knew everyone, Red Oak was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked at night and children played until the streetlights came on. Teachers taught the same children their parents once were, grocery clerks remembered birthdays, and the police station barely had enough cases to keep its small staff busy. The town lived in a bubble of routine, a rhythm that was predictable and safe. Or so it seemed, until one rainy Wednesday morning shattered that illusion forever. The Parker family lived in a modest two-story home at the edge of town. Their house blended easily with the others on the street, with its white siding, neat lawn, and the faint glow of a porch light that always seemed to be on. Elaine Parker, the mother, was well respected. At 42 years old, she had been a high school English teacher for nearly 2 decades. Former students often returned to thank her for pushing them to succeed, remembering her as the teacher who never let them give up on themselves. She wasn't just an educator, she was a pillar of the community, the kind of person people trusted with their children. That morning, however, Elaine's name would be spoken with hushed shock across town. Police cars lined the quiet street outside her home, their flashing lights cutting through the misty rain. Neighbors stood in their bathrobes, umbrellas in hand, whispering theories to each other. They could only see uniformed officers moving in and out of the Parker house, and the sight alone was enough to send a wave of unease through the neighborhood. Something terrible had happened, and no one wanted to believe what their eyes already suggested. Inside, the scene was nothing short of gruesome. Elaine Parker had been discovered in her bed, the sheets soaked in blood. She had been attacked while she slept, her life taken with brutal precision. Detectives were stunned to find no evidence of forced entry, no shattered windows, no broken locks, and no missing valuables. The house was eerily undisturbed, almost as if nothing had happened beyond that single horrific act. The familiarity of the setting only deepened the dreaded, wasn't he the work of a stranger who slipped in during the night? This was something far darker. As the investigation began, officers quickly zeroed in on the chilling possibility that the killer wasn't he an intruder at all, but someone who lived inside the house. Elaine had only one other resident under her roof, her 16-year-old son, Daniel Parker. On the surface, Daniel was everything parents in town wanted their children to be. He was a bright student, polite to adults, and never caused trouble. But the idea of a son harming his mother, especially a mother so loved by her community, was almost unthinkable. Yet the evidence and the circumstances pointed toward him, making the nightmare harder to dismiss. For a town where crime rarely escalated beyond petty theft or vandalism, the brutality of Elaine Parker's murder was unimaginable. That morning, the bubble of safety Red Oak had always lived in was pierced for good. A sense of innocence was lost, replaced by whispers of betrayal and horror. And as the truth slowly unfolded, the story would only grow darker, exposing secrets hidden behind the closed doors of a seemingly ordinary home. Daniel Parker's life had always appeared to be the picture of normalcy. At school, he blended easily into the crowd, never the loudest in the room, but never overlooked either. Teachers described him as sharp and attentive, a boy who finished his work on time and asked thoughtful questions in class. His grades reflected his discipline, and his report cards carried comments like responsible, respectful, and a pleasure to have in class. Friends often turned to him for help with assignments, trusting his patience and quiet intelligence to anyone observing from the outside. Daniel was the kind of teenager that gave parents and teachers alike a sense of pride. Yet beneath that carefully built image, Daniel's life was shaped by a tension few knew existed. His mother, Elaine, had been strict for as long as he could remember. She was never cruel, never violent, but her standards left little room for error. Curfews were enforced with precision, homework was double-checked before being turned in, and free time often came with conditions. While other boys in town spent long summer evenings at the park or at the movies, Daniel was expected to remain home, reading, studying, or preparing for what Elaine called a bright future. What others saw as nurturing, Daniel experienced as suffocating. His classmates never saw this side of his life. To them, he seemed fortunate, blessed with a mother who cared deeply about his success. Some envied the structure of his home, comparing it to their own more relaxed or distracted households. But Daniel kept his frustrations hidden, learning early that sharing them would only draw lectures about gratitude and responsibility. Inside his room, he carried a weight that grew heavier with each passing year, a sense of being trapped within rules he hadn't chosen. What made this tension especially dangerous was Daniel's way of coping. Instead of rebelling outwardly, as many teens might, he turned inward. He began keeping a private journal tucked beneath his mattress where he poured out thoughts he dared not speak aloud. At first, the entries were harmless complaints about not being allowed to stay out late or being scolded for leaving dishes in the sink. But over time, the tone shifted. His words became sharper, filled with anger and resentment. He wrote about wanting freedom, about imagining a life where his mother no longer dictated his every move. In those pages, the fantasy of escape slowly twisted into something darker. No one in town suspected anything unusual. Neighbors saw Daniel as the boy who helped carry groceries for the elderly and shoveled snow from driveways in the winter. Parents who taught at the same school as Elaine often remarked that she was lucky to have such a well-behaved son. But appearances masked the storm growing inside him. Each smile he gave in public, each polite gesture, served as a disguise. Behind closed doors, Daniel's resentment deepened, fed by the very discipline that once made him seem exceptional. The journal was his only outlet, the one place where he could speak without consequence. What started as harmless scribbles of frustration became a chilling blueprint for escape. Hidden in the ink were scattered fragments of thought that hinted at a violent solution, notes that no one would see until it was far too late. The night of the murder began like any other. Rain had been falling steadily since dusk, tapping softly against the windows of the Parker house. From the street, the home looked peaceful, its porch light casting a dim glow onto the wet pavement. Inside, Elaine had spent the evening marking papers at the dining room table before heading upstairs to bed. Nothing about the scene suggested that within hours, the ordinary calm would be shattered by a crime so brutal it would haunt the town forever. Daniel stayed in his room long after his mother had gone to sleep. To anyone who might have passed by, he appeared to be just another teenager staying up late, headphones in, eyes glued to his phone, but inside, his mind was racing. The entries in his journal had shifted from vague frustration to detailed planning, and now those words were pressing on him like a weight he could no longer carry. He sat in the dim light of his desk lamp, rehearsing each step in silence, knowing that the moment he left his room, there would be no turning back. At around 2 a.m, Daniel quietly opened his bedroom door. The house was silent except for the rain outside and the steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He walked slowly down the carpeted stairs, careful not to make a sound. In the kitchen, he paused, staring at the knife block on the counter. He reached for the largest blade, its polished steel reflecting the dim light from the stove clock. For a moment, he stood frozen, gripping the handle tightly, the enormity of his decision pressing down on him. But then he turned and began moving toward the stairs. The hallway leading to his mother's bedroom felt impossibly long. Each step seemed to echo in his ears, though the house itself remained silent. At the end of the hall, Elaine's bedroom door was slightly ajar, as it always was. Through the gap, he could see the faint outline of her sleeping form beneath the covers. She had no reason to suspect danger, no reason to stir. She was fast asleep, unaware that her son was standing in the doorway, knife in hand. When Daniel finally stepped inside, his movements were deliberate. Investigators would later say that most of the wounds were delivered while Elaine was still unconscious, meaning she never had a chance to defend herself or even wake up. The attack was swift, merciless, and chilling in its calculation. The sheets soaked quickly, the silence of the house broken only by the rain outside. Afterward, Daniel stood in the room for several minutes, staring at what he had done. He then turned, walked back to the kitchen, and washed the knife carefully under the tap. He dried it with a towel and slid it back into its slot in the block as though trying to erase the evidence of what had just occurred. Then he returned upstairs, climbed into his bed, and closed his eyes. To anyone who might have looked in on him at that moment, it would have seemed as though nothing had happened at all. The town outside slept on, oblivious to the fact that one of the most shocking crimes in its history had just taken place. When the 911 call came in just after sunrise, the dispatcher noted the shaky voice of a teenage boy reporting that his mother was dead. Patrol cars rushed to the Parker residence, sirens cutting through the rain-soaked morning air. Officers expected tragedy, perhaps a medical emergency or the aftermath of a burglary gone wrong. What they found inside was far more disturbing. Elaine Parker lay lifeless in her bed, the sheets saturated in blood, the bedroom heavy with the silence of violence. The crime scene was controlled chaos as investigators moved carefully through the house, cameras flashing, gloved hands collecting evidence. At first, Daniel presented himself as a shocked and grieving son. He told officers he had woken up and discovered his mother in that condition. He suggested that someone must have broken into the house during the night. His voice cracked as he explained, his hands trembling, though detectives later remarked that the display seemed strangely measured, more like a performance than genuine panic. Still, in the early moments of the investigation, officers took his words seriously. The thought of a teenage boy killing his own mother seemed unthinkable. Detectives began searching for signs of forced entry, examining windows, doors, and locks. Everything was intact, no glass was broken, no screens were cut, and there were no muddy footprints leading in or out. The house itself appeared undisturbed beyond the crime scene in Elaine's bedroom. The absence of stolen items raised further suspicion. Televisions, laptops, and jewelry were untouched. Whoever had killed Elaine had not come for valuables. This was not the work of a burglar. Forensics teams collected evidence methodically. They swabbed surfaces for fingerprints, dusted for traces on door handles, and examined the knife block in the kitchen. The largest knife was clean, but its placement seemed slightly off, as though it had been returned hastily. Meanwhile, Daniel was taken to the station for routine questioning. There, detectives noticed inconsistencies in his story. He claimed he had slept through the night and only discovered his mother in the morning, yet his fingernails carried faint traces of blood that did not belong to him. The turning point came with the discovery in his bedroom. Hidden beneath his mattress, officers found a black notebook filled with journal entries. The writing detailed months of resentment toward his mother, frustrations with her strict rules, and disturbing fantasies of escape. In chilling detail, he had outlined potential nights to act, even listing steps he would need to take. The journal read less like the venting of a frustrated teenager and more like the planning of a crime. When confronted with this evidence, Daniel's calm demeanor began to crack. Detectives pressed him about the blood under his nails, about the journal entries that matched the crime almost exactly, about the impossibility of an intruder leaving no trace. Slowly, the image of a grieving son collapsed. What remained was the portrait of a boy who had carefully hidden his anger until it consumed him. By the end of the day, Daniel Parker was no longer a witness. He was the prime suspect in his mother's murder. The trial of Daniel Parker drew national attention, transforming the quiet town of Red Oak into a place swarmed with reporters, cameras, and strangers eager for details of the crime. The courthouse, usually reserved for minor disputes and routine hearings, became the stage for one of the most shocking cases in the region's history. Families who once spoke of Daniel as a promising young man now whispered about betrayal and evil, struggling to reconcile the polite student they knew with the boy accused of slaughtering his own mother. Each day of the proceedings brought new revelations, each one more unsettling than the last. The prosecution wasted no time in painting Daniel as cold and calculating. They presented the journal entries first, reading aloud the passages where he fantasized about his mother's death and described the steps he would take to carry it out. Jurors listened in silence as the words were displayed on a projector, their unease growing with each carefully written line. Forensic experts testified about the traces of blood found beneath Daniel's fingernails, explaining that they could not have appeared there if he had only discovered the body in the morning as he claimed. The kitchen knife, though washed, still bore microscopic traces linking it to Elaine's wounds. The evidence told a story Daniel could not explain away. The defense, however, tried to shift the narrative. They argued that Daniel was not a hardened killer but a teenager pushed beyond his limits by years of suffocating control. They claimed he had acted in a sudden explosion of rage, not with premeditation, and that his journal was merely a teenager's outlet for frustrations rather than a blueprint for murder. They presented testimonies about Elaine's strict parenting style, highlighting her rigid rules and high expectations. The defense hoped to persuade the jury that this was a case of emotional strain snapping into violence rather than a carefully planned execution. But the prosecution delivered a devastating blow with evidence uncovered in Elaine's bank records hours before the murder. Daniel had attempted to schedule an online transfer of money from his mother's account into his own. It was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, they argued. It was preparation. The jury heard how he had plotted not only the crime but also the days afterward, envisioning himself free, financially independent, and unburdened by his mother's discipline. The timing of the transfer aligned perfectly with the killing, leaving little doubt about his intent. The courtroom grew heavy as the verdict approached. After only a short deliberation, the jury returned. Daniel Parker was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Gasps filled the room, some from shock, others from relief. For many, the verdict confirmed what they already feared, that Daniel had not simply lost control in a moment of anger, but had chosen, planned, and carried out the destruction of the woman who had raised him. Red Oak was left scarred by the crime. Neighbors who once spoke warmly of Elaine and Daniel now walked their streets with a new wariness, their sense of safety permanently fractured. The house where the murder occurred stood empty for months, a grim reminder of what had happened behind its walls. For the community, the tragedy was more than a crime story, it was the loss of trust in the ordinary, the realization that even in the safest of places, darkness can grow unnoticed until it consumes everything.